Hi, I'm John TAYLOR GATTO, and this is What You've Been Missing. The metaphor schooling clearly tells you what it's expected to deliver. Education's diametrically opposite to that. I think it starts with the assumption that we get from a fingerprint or from DNA that no two people are alike, and that the ultimate realization of yourself is to find that uniqueness where your apparent physical resemblance to everybody else sort of dissolves as an illusion and you stand absolutely alone, or you can select when you want to be part of the larger group. It seems clear to me that the business of schooling has done what Orwell clearly saw you do, or what Walter Lippmann said you do back in the 1920s. You steal the key language of the person the group you want to overthrow, and you redefine it, and people then become confused. It's Newspeak in 1984. That's why people are being ritualized. The awareness of these contrary dynamics is what gives rise to the theories of dialectic. Aristotle all the way through history, the variety of them, but they participate in the same way, is essentially asking you for your own self-defense, not to assume that what anyone says, especially as they climb the authority ladder, is the truth. Often the misinformation comes from innocent self-delusion, but just as often as you move up the power pyramid, it comes from a malign intent toward your own individuality. We're so well conditioned from infancy not to see the truth or relate the truth, but to shave it, that the first step in reaching for an education is to mistrust what you most are certain of, to mistrust that. Now, it may survive, but it needs tested not once until you're exhausted from testing it. People should begin immediately to ask politely, why are we doing this? It's a question you never hear because it's heresy. I mean, the beleaguered classroom teacher doesn't know why he or she's doing that. They're told to do it. Maybe they can give it 5% personal spin. You don't know, and if you started to care, the logic of schooling would dissolve. Lincoln said the British are financing the whole Western movement, and they're attempting to reinstall their class system. The Civil War changed that. We're sold that it was a great crusade against slavery by the school system. The major historians who've turned their attention to that say that slavery was already dead. It gave necessity to get rid of the Southern politicians who were trained in dialectical thinking, in rhetoric, and could run circles around the Northern politicians in Congress. They could produce the most compelling arguments for this or that. And so the South had to be gotten rid of.
Understanding those dry goods like cotton from the South that were produced by slaves were then going to factories in the North. And the factory owners in the North figured out that the slave owners were paying too much overhead. It cost a lot to keep a whole family fed, etc. And there were letters exchanged, and they actually discovered it was cheaper. Why not make everyone a slave who doesn't know that they're a slave?
A wage slave.
Right.
The public dependent upon media and pulpits, which were subsidized by the owners. They couldn't find a zone where they could think clearly, or someone would say, yeah, here's the truth, think about it. So what we got was a second American Revolution between 1865 and about 1910. This time the British won again, but they didn't win by force of arms, but by force of insight into the way opinion is created. The Rockefeller family can actually be traced way back in Dutch history. There's an ancestor of the Rockefellers who set up a rather detailed plan for global government hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It had just one of these flow charts that showed how you were going to do that. Or the great irony, of course, is that Rockefeller and Carnegie's families were fringe people in the United States, but using their brilliant insight into leverage and how it works, both were able to take nothing and pyramid it into quite a bit. School removes your volition. Fichte said there was no way to heal the disobedience gene in people who thought for themselves. Fichte said we have to set up a system of universal forced schooling in which we destroy the imagination. Calvin said the only way the elect will ever be safe, because they're outnumbered so heavily, is to set up a system of universal compulsion schooling with the intention of destroying the imagination and filling the head with garbage. The father of this has to be Plato, the Greek aristocrat who speaks through the mouth of Socrates. The Unitarians, who were one of the great heresies over the last 500 years, worked out a way to initially convert to whatever religion had a church in the area, and then when they were the majority, they would vote the thing out of business, take the assets, and reopen as a Unitarian parish. The entire Massachusetts school committee, no accident, every last member was a Unitarian, even though there were less than 1% of the Massachusetts population, because they understood leverage. What is the symbol of the Fabian socialists in Britain? It's the wolf in sheep's clothing. They have a big laugh at how easy it is to fool. There are no continuous governments in human history. None of them last very long. They had already become a virtual global society. Or this is a good way to get out of the Depression. Good way to cow dissidents in the population always is to declare a national emergency. Then you have an excuse for foreclosing freedom of speech. What Carroll Quigley, the head of the Foreign Service Department at Georgetown University, no marginal school, what he did was use his invitation to be the only human being ever invited to view the files of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I believe its predecessor also. What he did was to actually write a major piece of nonfiction, must be 1,300 pages long, and he made the fatal mistake of being a superb writer and thinker, so that it's accessible to anyone who gets a hold of a copy of the book. Sells out instantly. And any conspiracy theory you've ever heard of is documented, only not as a conspiracy theory. Gives you the name, the date, the time, the actual letters. Oh, good God. Well, somebody got hung for that. And to institutionalize the anti-educational nature of school. Once it's institutionalized, Nobody has to know what's going on. That's the way you make your living. My grandfather explained to me that the way you train fleas, I used to go to Hubert's Flea Circus on 42nd Street and watch fleas draw Roman chariots and swing on trapezes. He said, you've got to break their spirits. If you put fleas in a container, they'll instantly leap off and head off in all directions because they have flea agendas. And even they don't all off in the same direction. They have individual agendas. So he says, you got to break that autonomy in the flea first. And the way you do that is you put them in a container, small, with a lid on. And the fleas keep attempting to follow their own agenda, and they strike themselves over and over again. And if you come back in an hour or so, they're all huddled in a mass together. Now when you take the lid off, they don't even try to escape. Now, he said, you can impose your will on the flea. I knew that I had been hired as the lid on the container. That's what we all had been hired to do. And this principle was understood. Training fleas was a delight of emperors thousands of years ago. And whoever trained those fleas understood the principle and saw that it could be applied, as it is in military training, to human beings, as it is in much religious training. Not all, but much. What's surprising is that these insights and even these activities that don't depend on modern technology, I mean, these are understood a long time ago. And the only subject at the Roman collegia in the 5th century was crowd control. How you divide to conquer, what buttons on the human organ you press to produce certain sounds. I mean, that's 16 centuries ago. What has happened in the intervening 16 centuries? They forgot that, or was it added to? Has it become amazingly sophisticated? Less and less people necessary to produce more and more leverage. It isn't the age in itself that limits insight. It's the imprint of rigid patterns of habits. A wonderful quote from William James Psychology, I think printed in 1890, and the book given credit for establishing psychology as an academic subject. Now, this is a direct quote from William James Psychology 121 years ago. Habit is the enormous flywheel of society, its most precious agent. It alone saves the children of fortune from the envious uprisings of the poor. It alone prevents the most repulsive jobs from being deserted. It holds the miner in his darkness. It keeps different social strata from mixing. It says freedom and flexibility is much more valuable than planning. Insight comes only by getting out of ruts and plugging into a variety of methods. So these great truths, it isn't that we're discovering them now. We're taking them out of their burial places and saying, hey, look, wake up. The world is much bigger and much different than you believe it is because you've been conditioned to believe it's that way. Pestalozzi. What he had that was intriguing to the Prussian hierarchy and really the global hierarchy was that his method of kindness, and it may have been sincere, his method of kindness was a new weapon in the arsenal. Instead of whipping the poor, threatening them, menacing them, tormenting them, you killed them with kindness. The written principles of the Fabians are pestilential. By extending this blanket of kindness to people, it's still effective in that a big fraction of the American population expects charity and sees it as a blessing. Now, it's not hard to see why on this day or that day it could be a blessing, but overall, that you get weaker and weaker, like your arm gets weaker if it doesn't lift stuff above your head. I mean, it's such a fundamental principle of human physics, including mental physics, that to pull the wool over so many people's eyes.